Welcome. My name is Keith Obbie, and among other things, I direct the Institute for the Study of Judiciary, Politics, and Media, which is a university-level center here at SU, and it's a collaboration between the College of Law, the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, and the Newhouse School of Public Communications. One of the things we do at IJPM is every spring we organize a lecture series on law, politics, and the media. And a lecture series like this is actually the work of many hands. The lecture series is jointly organized by the instructors in Law, Politics, and Media course, Lisa Dolak, professor at the law school, and Roy Gutterman, professor at Newhouse, and myself. It is also today we're being joined by criminal law students in Professor Lauren Goulden's criminal law class, and I thank Professor Goulden for suggesting the idea and volunteering her classroom for our use. It is also jointly sponsored not only by IJPM but by the Tully Center for Free Speech, directed by Roy Gutterman. Again, this guy, I mentioned him twice. I've been speaking 2 minutes, mentioned him twice, and that's because if admiring Roy is a crime, well, guilty. Our speaker today is Mark Obbie. And the title of his lecture is Criminal Justice Journalism and the Politics of Fear, Finding the Balance Between Education, Entertainment, and True Crime Narratives. Mark is going to speak to us today for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have a break for Q&A. At the end of the lecture at 5 o'clock, we will have a reception next door in room 204. So there'll be food and drink there, an opportunity to continue conversation about the subject of Mark Obbie's lecture. So who is Mark Obbie? Mark Obbie is a legal journalist with, I think, nearly 30 years of experience in the field, over 30 years of experience in the field. He's former executive editor of the American Lawyer magazine, where he edited features on the front of the book. He not only managed the newsroom staff, but Mark was in charge of the magazine's well-known program of recruiting and training entry-level journalists. He also managed internet operations for a network of legal magazines and newspapers, and was editor and publisher of the Dallas-based weekly newspaper Texas Lawyer. Mark also covered courts, cops, and city government for the Houston Post and the Warren, Ohio Tribune Chronicle. He taught investigative journalism at New School University, and he also, for a number of years, was a member of the magazine journalism faculty here at Syracuse University in the Newhouse School. As a freelance magazine writer, his work has appeared in such magazines as Inc., American Lawyer, Slate.com, and Oprah Magazine. He is also the author, most recently, of a book published by Kendall Single, called God's Nobodies, Misguided Faith, and Murder in the Life of One American Family. And that book will inform his discussion today. Mark was also, during his time here at Syracuse, part of the small team that helped create IJPM 7 years ago. And it is a genuine pleasure to welcome him back to campus. Please join me in welcoming Mark Obbie.
Thank you very much. I'm relieved to get through a Keith Obbie introduction without any risque jokes, although Keith's my hero in lecturing. He put the vaudeville back in political science. I've always tried to emulate him, but promise not too much vaudeville today. I do want to leave a lot of time for questions at the end. We're going to try to have a conversation here while I walk through the program that I have planned, but I really do want to leave time at the end for questions covering things that I may not get into. For example, how I did the reporting of this book. I'm not going to go into that. That's more of a Newhouse School lecture, but if you have specific questions about that, I'll talk about it. I'm going to give a brief summary of the book's storyline, but not go into a lot of detail. I did notice a noticeable spike in downloads last night, late last night. And so I think that most of the people here who have read it, I will give a quick summary. The main idea here today, what I really want to try to do, is approach one key question. Does this do any good? Does telling a story like this accomplish any public good? I want to ask that question in a number of different ways, but I want to try to approach the answer to that in a methodical way, the way that a writer approaches storytelling. I'm going to be asking questions of this story and stories in general of the sort that professional writers and editors ask of a story, that they demand of a story. It must meet certain tests. We're not going to talk exclusively about this story, but it will be the hub. I'm going to do a little Glenn Beck imitation with a lot of arrows and boxes, and you're looking worried. I'm going to try to list some ideas, and we're going to draw connections, but I want it to be a conversation, so I invite you to join in. Writers are famous for overthinking what their stories are about, and I don't want to stand up here and try to describe what all the motivations. It sounds like some sort of acting workshop, you know, getting inside the character. I really want to try to describe what I hoped would come of this when I finished the project. Brief synopsis. I was teaching at the Newhouse School when I first learned of Tim Giannichetti, and that was on the very first day of the fall semester in 2006, when he was arrested for killing his mother, charged with second-degree murder. And what made the story especially notable was who the Giannichettis were. John Giannichetti, a Manlius a professional firefighter in Manlius, a suburb east of here, had died along with another firefighter back in 2002. Barely 4 years later, his son kills his widow. So obviously it's an impossible tragedy. How could this double tragedy occur? And we want to know what had been going on between them, obviously. Nothing really substantive came to light for a really long time. Between August of 2006 and July of 2007, Tim pled guilty in the spring, but even then, nothing really came out. It was only on the day of his sentencing in July of 2007 that a few details came out. I wasn't reporting on this. I was simply a spectator like everyone else. But during the sentencing, the judge made a few comments that caught my eye and made me intrigued about what this was really all about, what had motivated Tim to kill his mother, and what was going on in the family. And I made what is often a mistake, but in this case I think it was fortuitous. I looked at the PostStandard story online, and I scrolled down to the comments. And I started reading the comments. Well, sometimes, often, usually, that drives me insane. And as usual, it did. But a couple key things jumped out at me. First of all, many people were howling with rage over how could the brutal murder of this woman yield a 15-year sentence. Why isn't he sentenced to death? Why isn't he sentenced to life in imprisonment? A normal kind of layman question, maybe a normal human question. Why is this enough? But that to me was an interesting question. What compelled this to be a manslaughter? And then there were other comments in there about the family, about the church that they belonged to, that made me very interested. I began working on the story in a very low-key way, just pestering people for documents, pestering people for interviews. But over a long period of time, over the course of years, I managed to talk to most of the people involved in this and to try to figure out what had led from the death of John Giannichetti to the death of Pamela Giannichetti to a third tragedy, which was the dissolution of the family, the expulsion from the family of Tim Giannichetti's grandmother in some sort of feud that, again, wasn't very understandable. So it was a mystery, and I approached it at first, my brain, as a journalist, approached it as a mystery. What really happened here? What's really going on here? Little tidbits came out in news stories, not very much. As a legal journalist, I wanted to know, did the system function properly here? Was justice done, whatever that is, in a case like this? And I wanted to know why this seems so controversial in the background. What were these people gossiping about? What were they fighting about? They seemed to know things, but they weren't They were speaking in code almost, arguing with each other over what had happened. So I started my work, and here's the beginning process of how a writer approaches a story. There are a lot of myths about how this works. There are probably a lot of different ways that different writers do it. This is how I do it, and this is how the people I've worked with think about it. The first thing you really think about is, assuming I can find out the answers to these questions, I can answer these mysteries, what if it is just a messed up kid who had been trouble all along and he did something really predictably awful? Then what? Is that a book? Is that a story? Is that unusual enough? What if it's just a really sad but common murder? What if Pamela Giannichetti, who obviously is the victim here, was just an ordinary, struggling, well-meaning mom who couldn't help but what happened to her, and it is, again, just a mundane, sad, ordinary crime? What if the people who are going to tell me these things are lying? What if they're just making things up? How am I going to figure out how they're telling the truth? And what if this aftermath, the family fight, is just like lots of family fights, like all of our families, petty, full of baggage from the past, but ultimately meaningless to the rest of us? What if there are simply no surprises about all this? Then it's not a story. And a reporter has to be ready to confront those questions and walk away from a story. Assuming, though, that those bad things don't happen, that those answers don't turn out to undercut the value of the story, then the next step is, how do I tell the story? And what is the purpose of telling the story? And that's really where I'm going to go with how a reporter frames the story. I was just talking to a former colleague of mine at the Newhouse School a minute ago about an exercise that they're using in the magazine department for journalism students, talking about going through exercises, bringing in editors from magazines and having the students pitch them. It's a particular magazine, a particular topic. How do you pitch men's health on a story about treadmills? That was a terrible example, but it's the only one that came to mind at first. How can I position this topic to make sense for that audience? Well, that's what I mean by framing. It has to make sense for the audience. It has to meet certain tests of being current. So without knowing who the publisher is, I have to figure out all these variables as I'm working on the story. I have to figure out, how am I going to tell this story? What is ultimately going to be the point of this story? In a minute, I'm going to start listing, I hope with your help, the many different themes, ideas, topics that emerge in the story, and try to figure out, well, what could any of those turn into as the sort of core, the spine of telling the story. You know, you hear lawyers talk about narratives, politicians talk about narratives, everyone uses that word, overuses that word. Journalists really use that word all the time, and they really are writing narratives, a beginning, middle, and end, a story that has a certain arc to it that, often chronological, moves us through the facts. Is this just a pure narrative, or does it digress into issues, into topics, into themes? And if it is just a pure narrative, what is the point of telling it? What are people going to get from it? What is the public good? So I had to ask myself all those questions as I'm working on the story, as I'm trying to figure out, well, what actually did happen here? What are the facts of this story? At the same time, readers approach a story wondering, well, what's the payoff for me? Why am I reading about this? Why am I going to spend my time, spend my money to find out about this story? What's it supposed to do for me? What is the value? In a moment, we're going to talk about what that is too. All of journalism, unlike many other kinds of writing, unlike corporate writing, unlike academic writing, journalism is purely discretionary. You don't have to read it. The audience does not have to consume what we journalists produce. And in fact, some people don't. And all journalists have to approach their stories with a market in mind for that story. I'm not ashamed of that. I don't run from that, because if we want to have journalism that tells us what's going on in the world, there has to be a market for it, and journalists have to be able to make a living producing it. And so while we're working on these, we have to think, well, what are readers, what's the market for this? What kinds of people are going to want to read this, and why? What are they going to get out of it? So all of those factors add up to a calculus of the value to the reader, of the agenda of the writer, and what the different ideas, the different points of the story are. I used to tell my magazine students, every good story, when you tell me what the story is about and why you want to do it, you should be able to boil that down to a sentence, and then to a phrase, and then maybe just to one word, which is a little absurd, because we all want to say a lot more, but there has to be some core in that story. It has to stand for something. It has to be about something that can be simplified, not in an idiotic way, not in a cheap way, but in a way that just distills it. So all the time I'm trying to figure out what that word is. I'll tell you at the end of this little exercise what I chose as my one word, but I invite you to come to your own conclusions about whether it has value, what the value might be, or what the harm might have been, and whether one outweighs the other. So I'm going to start playing Glenn Beck here, and start charting on 3 axes, 3 lists, and then we'll try to connect the dots. But 3 ways of looking at a story like this. While I am talking about my story, and I'm going to use the examples from it, I want you to think more generally, also as readers, about what value you get out of the story. So I don't know if we're going to be able to see this here. This is a nice whiteboard at least. So first, from the reader's point of view, what's the appeal of the story? Why do I want to spend my time looking at this? From the writer's point of view, all the years I taught, I never got good at talking and writing at the same time, unless I was writing the thing that I was. Never mind. I'll deal with it. Keith got my joke. All right. What is the writer's mission? What is the writer trying to accomplish here? And then once we have thought about those 2 things, we're going to think about God's Nobodies in particular, of what the different themes, the different topics, the different ideas that emerge from that might serve either readers or might come from the writer's agenda. So as readers, whether you're talking about a news story, a magazine story, watching a TV show, but especially reading a book, a short book like this, a normal length book, readers have all kinds of choices to make about what they're going to read, and books of certain types appeal to us. So what are some of those appeals? What do we get out of reading books or consuming any kind of nonfiction literature? Anybody?
Entertainment.
Yeah, that's a big one, right? It could be highbrow, it could be lowbrow. But it's a diversion. It's a diversion. It gets us out of our day-to-day lives. It is just a way to pass the time. It is fun. It is a distraction. But it's purely entertainment. Other benefits of reading books. What do we get from reading books?
See how other people live. See how other people
So how can
deal
we
with their behavior.
So it's learning about the world around you. There's an intellectual. There's maybe no direct payoff to you to know this, but you're learning. It's education. It's intellectual. It's learning about some part of the world that you're curious about, that you think it would be helpful to know something about. Other needs that readers have.
This might go with that one, but perspective.
So what do you mean by that?
Just a different way of thinking about certain things.
So you're gaining perspective on the world. You're learning. This is going to be a nice big fat category that really is about learning about things that don't have some direct, tangible benefit in your life, immediate benefit, but you want to learn about other people, other things. History would fall into this category, right? I mean, we can't always put some direct, I'm not going to be able to go out and make money or be a better person necessarily just from reading this biography of Benjamin Franklin, but I just want to know this. I want a perspective on that era in history or on that country. Other thoughts. Not all books are super serious, right? They're not all heavy. They might just be a how-to. Lots and lots of these. Teaching us how to do something. Do our taxes, exercise, cook. I mean, very simple but instructional kinds of needs that we have as readers to try to get that kind of thing. And lifestyle advice, that sort of comes along with it. Now this might be as deep as how we relate to our family, how we make ourselves happier people, but ultimately it's an instructional kind of book. It's giving us advice from an expert, you hope, that will improve something in our lives. We're reading it with that goal in mind. Any other needs that you think readers have when they approach a book? Why do I want to pick this thing up?
You can use it to impress other people.
So that's more of a vanity. This is huge, by the way. This appeal. I'm not surprised you mentioned this. This is a big part of why people read. They don't want to look out of it. They want to be up on things. They're picturing themselves talking to their neighbors or their colleagues, and they want to look smart.
Well, and I think maybe in the same vein too, and it's kind of circular, but like you start a book to finish it and feel accomplished.
So the actual act of reading it makes you feel like you got something done. Yeah, it's I'm not sure where I would put that. It's partly an entertainment thing. You're just keeping busy. You want to do something else. All right, those are some of the big topics that drive readers' interest. What about writers? I've already mentioned a big one: to make a living, and that sort of transcends the more specific things I'm going to talk about, but that is something that that writers have to think about when they're thinking about whether I'm going to write a book or spend all this time on a magazine article with somebody going to pay me to do this. But what are some of the agendas that writers have in pursuing a particular story?
To persuade you to think something.
Okay, so it's an argument. It might be. It could be about anything, right? It could be about politics or religion or anything. But it's persuasion, okay?
Spread information.
That's a real general one. I mean, that sort of applies to all of these things. Are you thinking of maybe a specific kind of information, or you want to let people know about something that happened?
Or maybe something hasn't gotten much attention.
Okay. So you want to draw attention to the obscure. There's a broader category. I'll put that under the sort of contrarian nature of writers. You don't know about this, or you think this. I'm going to tell you something that surprises you. I'm going to be contrary. I'm going to surprise you with something that you need to know, or would be surprised to know, or don't expect to know. But it's a contrarian agenda. Others?
I see argumentative and confrontational as almost in the same loop, as in the same pinpointing circle.
Well, this is to be contrarian. This is to make a specific argument to try to persuade people. Yeah, and these may overlap, as will these. Something could inform us of something that we don't really need to know, and at the same time being entertaining. So yeah, there's some overlap.
You aim for the writing?
For the writer.
Yeah, you want to be famous.
Sure, that is maybe beyond the income agenda, but to be known as a writer. Any other agendas that you think writers have? Yeah.
I mean, give them an opportunity to explore something they don't really know much about.
So for the writer himself or herself to grow. So really, it's just curiosity. I'm going to add one here. This will make Keith happy. You're going to be my foil. But the sort of wonk impulse that a lot of writers have, I have it, which is that we are interested in public policy, we're interested in the workings of government in particular, or business, and we want to explain how does it really work? How do these things actually function? Do they work well? Which leads to sort of another function, the watchdog role of journalism. Did this system operate properly? Did justice get done? Did people do what they're supposed to do? That is a big one, at least in the sort of journalism that we're going to be talking about here. About the law, that's a big one. Any other, we haven't mentioned a really big one when I say agenda. I mean, it could be under argument, but ideology. A lot of people believe this more than anything is what drives journalists, is that they have an ideology they want to push. That's a little narrower than just saying that they have an argument to make on something. That argument could have been based on newly gathered facts. Oh, I'm arriving at a conclusion. Now I'm going to make my argument. Well, this supposes that you started with a belief and you're going to push that belief. You're going to make your case for what you want people to believe.
Isn't some writers have in their agenda a desire to prove how smart they are or how well read they are, to send out a message that, let me pat myself on the back?
Sure.
An ego-driven.
Sure, I mean, that shows up in here. I found out something you didn't know, or I wrote the best book on this topic that you could imagine, which brings up another motivation, another agenda for writers, which is simply to be literary, to write, regardless of the devices that you're using to write the book. You just want it to be written in a really, really compelling way, a really notable way. You know, thinking about true crime for a second, In Cold Blood is the Truman Capote book that everyone always cites, always, whenever talking about this genre, because it broke molds. It was a new way of telling stories, nonfiction stories, and so all writers want to be the next Truman Capote. So there are lots of different agendas that writers have. One other, inspirational. Again, there's overlap here, but you want people to come out of a story having some sort of hope, having some sort of good message that comes from reading the story that they have that they're glad that they read it. Now, all the while that we're talking about this, I want to connect these ideas to the topics that are in this story by thinking about what are the pluses and minuses. What are the pluses of entertainment, which is that you're making people happy, you're giving them a way to spend their time that pleases them, reading a funny story. I read the Bill Murray profile in GQ. I'm a month behind in my GQ, and it made me laugh. I was enjoying it. That's a good public benefit, maybe a trivial one, but it was enjoyable. But entertainment in this genre is especially treacherous, right? Because if it's purely entertainment, if it's just to titillate, if it's just to get people excited, just to read a good thriller as if it were fiction, except it's not, it's real people who got really hurt, then it's what? It's just pure exploitation for entertainment and for some of these other motives of the writing. So that's one of the big downsides of approaching, especially a true crime book this way. But let's think, as we're walking through these topics, what is the potential upside? What is the potential downside on some of these topics? All right. So if those of you who've read the story can add to whatever list I might come up with. But what are some of the topics that emerge from this story? I'll give you one example so that you can see what I'm talking about. Sorry for my handwriting. Murder sentencing. How is it decided? What separates murder from manslaughter? What's the appropriate sentence for in a case like this? But that is one topic that is suggested, at least, in this story. I will say, by the way, that when I envisioned writing this book, I envisioned writing a big, fat, hardcover book that would intersperse the story with chapters that talked about some of these topics that we're going to talk about, the substantive topics that are suggested in the story. I had hoped that it would branch out into those things. And when I sold it to a publisher that didn't want to do that, wanted a shorter, stripped down narrative of just the story, then I resorted to doing some of this on my blog, adding on the substantive plugins that might have been chapters in the book. So murder sentencing is one topic that comes out of this story. We know it's controversial. We know it's a decision that had to be made in the story. We see how it gets done. What else? What other topics? There are really some really obvious ones here.
Why?
Why what?
Why did he murder his mom?
That's more of a factual narrative question, I think. But I think what I'm trying to get at here are topics that transcend this story. What happened here illustrates a bigger idea.
Faith or religion.
Okay? So, and we don't even have to say. So we're talking about actual beliefs, we're talking about the effect that it has on people, but yeah, that's one of the big topics in this story.
Abusive relationships, generally.
Okay? Okay? Other topics.
Sexual identity.
Right.
Coping with tragedy.
Good. Other topics.
Emotional distress.
Can you elaborate a little bit? What do you mean?
How I guess it kind of goes along with what she said, like how they reacted to certain situations, but just
How people
emotional
act
abuse
under stress, how people behave under stress, okay? Maybe I'll put it this way. Trauma and behavior, that's not very good. But not exactly what you meant, but we'll remember. Yes?
class,
Explain a little.
like middle to upper class, the situation was kind of isolated in Manly, kind of a well-to-do town, and a lot of the members involved were middle to upper class.
Okay, and how that plays into a crime or in family life or,
The outcome of the case.
okay, and how the case was decided. All right. Other topics.
Like secrecy, privacy.
Personal.
For the church itself, how secretly wanted everything to be kept.
Okay.
Only amongst the members and grandmother, how she didn't want anyone knowing that she has spoken.
Okay. Secrets. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Right, that's a huge one, right? This is a thread that runs through is how some of these other things interact with a particular family, how a particular family acts. I'm running out of room here. Family dynamics. I'm going to offer one that might not be quite so obvious, but it was one that was important in my mind, at least when I started, and that's loyalty. One of the threads that I really thought was important was the firefighters' loyalty to their fallen brother, something I didn't know much about that culture of the firefighters, and I just found it very touching that they were that engaged for that long, still engaged. Yes.
Like psychological care.
Mental health.
Yeah.
Yes, mental illness. Yes.
Media influence?
Okay.
It was touched on a little bit with the newspaper, but.
Right. Okay. You see, we have a lot of topics. It's like a laundry.
Accepting responsibility.
Okay. That goes a little into murder sentencing, right? But it's much broader than that. It's about ethics. It's about.
And how he goes from accepting that at one point to the end where all of a sudden he wants to appeal it.
Right. Right.
How he goes back and forth.
Good point.
This might go with sentencing, but like how society accepts everything up there, and whether they say like, oh, 15 years is too long, not long enough, and how society will judge him.
So more of a public opinion take
Yeah.
on that could come under this too, right? I mean, media and public opinion, or is that, do you see that as a distinct? That's a big one that runs through a lot of the IGPM programs, the effect that public opinion has on the way judges behave, on the way that the law functions. Yes, sir.
Manipulation.
In personal relationships,
There's a couple different ways. The media manipulation and the way the church manipulated its members.
right? And keep in mind, a lot of these, most of these at this point, are question marks. We don't all have to agree on them, and we certainly haven't established any of those facts. But that's one of the questions.
Don't forgive it.
Yeah. That was the theme of the magazine version that I wrote, because that's what the editors were most interested in. And it was the one that fit that magazine's agenda. Oprah Magazine wanted a story about that. And so that's how I framed the story. That's how I told the story. It sounds manipulative to people who haven't worked as writers. But if all you're going to do is throw all the facts onto a piece of paper and ask people to sort it out and figure out, well, what happened here and what does it all mean and what does it all add up to, then they won't be able to do that on their own. Writers have to lead people through stories, and then they can be questioned, rightfully so, they can be questioned for how they made their choices and what path they led people through and whether they were fair in the way that they assembled those facts. I think we've hit the big ones, and I want to make sure I save some time to think about some of these things in the context of what readers get out of it, what writers are trying to do, and whether it balances out to be a public good or a public evil, a negative. So what would be we won't be able to hit all of these, but I want to hit some of the key ones. What would be the benefit to readers of any of these tie into murder sentencing? What difference does it make to me if nobody in my family has gone through this? Why do I need to know how that works? What's the payoff for the reader? Is there one? Certainly not every reader cares about this, but somebody who does find it interesting, what do they get out of that? Out of knowing that? And what does that do?
Maybe helps the reader determine why somebody is behaving instead of just looking to find generally view it.
So they have a more nuanced understanding of human behavior and the justice system. Maybe that makes them a better citizen. Maybe it has just an intellectual benefit. I shouldn't say just, it has an intellectual benefit. It makes them smarter about the world around them. But they have a benefit to themselves of understanding, oh, that's how that works. Not everyone goes to prison forever and ever. Maybe there are reasons why certain killings are treated differently in the system. Okay? What other topics do we want to? Mental illness. In the story, I talk about how Tim in particular had a host of behavioral issues, personality problems, mental illness, and what the psychiatrists psychiatrists and psychologists said about that in the case, and a little bit about how that plays out in the commission of the crime. Yesterday, as a matter of fact, I posted more about that and the role of the findings of psychiatry in matricide in particular. There have been a few studies that try to pinpoint what is going on inside someone's head and what effect that has. But knowing what Tim's diagnosis was and what led to that, what benefit does that serve readers? Is it entertaining? Not terribly. It's awfully grim, right? It's not fun reading to know that. You could make an argument that there's an actual service element. This is what journalists refer to as service journalism, where it's good to know that certain problems can fester from grief, from the death of a father, from being closeted and feeling unable to talk about it, to figure out what to do about that. The interactions with his mother, which are terribly fraught and angry kinds of interactions between them, but it's all bottled up. If people know that that's possible, that happened in one case, maybe it's unfair for them to generalize, but they can at least take lessons from that, in addition to just understanding how people function, understanding how people work. What's the writer's agenda in telling that particular angle on the story? What are you trying to accomplish by telling that story? It's not going to be contrarian. It's kind of what we expect, right? People have problems and then bad things happen. It's a little on the wonky side. It's psychiatry. I want to explain how the mind works. I want to explain what people do under pressure. I want to explain that this isn't just some fluke, that this might actually have been, if not foreseeable, at least understandable in retrospect. We can see what happened. Yeah.
I was going to say curiosity.
Yeah, you just want to understand. You want to understand a little bit more about the world. Coping with tragedy. If a reader approaches this story to try to understand what did these people go through, what was that experience like? Is that what does that serve? What need does that serve? Maybe regionally, around here, there could be some people who want to know what happened in this story. They want to know more about this story because people are talking about it, and they want to be more aware of it. But it's more of an intellectual need too. We want to understand really what the world is about. What about the church angle? It's a big part of the story, and it's an unusual part of the story. It's a delicate part of the story because it is one of the reasons why this turned into a big controversy in the first place, was because the act of trying to explain what had been going on turns into a controversy of its own, because it becomes it is seen as judging a faith instead of simply explaining what happened and why. It's perceived as having a big negative, which is to hold up a faith and say, this is bad because it had these bad effects. What good does it do people to read a story like that, if any? What bad does it do?
I think it serves as almost under the umbrella of being intellectual, because it's very about other people. But I also think that a bad side effect is that it can be reinforcing any sort of negative stereotypes we've had about a certain person, especially just religious fanatics in general.
Sure, it could be a caricature. It could hold people up to ridicule in a way that makes them very defensive. So that is a trade-off. You have to ask yourself, what is the good of telling this story, of trying to go into this part of the story, versus running that risk that people are going to be offended, that they aren't going to want that kind of scrutiny of something deeply held and sincerely held faith and a method of following that.
It also raises suspicions about the motivations of the writer.
Right. How so?
So if the reaction is that if any of these topics, but you can take the church one, the faith religion one, if it raises in the reader this confirmation of negative stereotypes, and some of the readers say, well, why would the writer be doing this? Maybe because he has an ideological position. Maybe he's opposed to religion, or opposed to this religion.
Or offended by this particular belief.
This belief that this religion holds, and so that of the writer's many possible agendas, the one that rises to the top are these ones that are negative.
Right. And that, in fact, has been a point of view expressed on my blog and in a review, and that's a sincere belief. I think it's safe to say that's an accusation that I have to defend myself against, because that would be an agenda that doesn't serve any legitimate interest among readers. It would simply be a hatchet job to go after people and to hold them up to ridicule. As a writer, you have to try to figure out, what have I learned? What facts do I now have in hand? What do I understand about this? What have people told me that is checked out? What have people told me that doesn't check out, that I do not believe? What do I believe? What do I not believe? And what does that add up to? In my case, I spent an enormous amount of time trying to gather those facts, but all the while I had that pressure of trying to figure out, well, what is it a story? What does it add up to? What really happened here? And why does it matter to anyone else? I had my own agenda that I still hold, and that isn't really what we're focusing on right here. But my main agenda started out as a criminal justice reporter, was to try to explain, well, was justice done here? And the sad fact is that I never really came to clarity about that. I was asked by a reporter, so was that sentence correct? Was it too high, too low? And I realized that even though I had entered this transaction with that being kind of my primary mission to try to figure out, I had never really come to any kind of conclusion about that. I stated it on my blog yesterday that I thought it indeed was fair because it fits the sort of average sentence of what we can find out in this type of crime, and that it had legal and factual justification for being charged as such. But I had one agenda when I started out, and I never really came to any sort of conclusion about that. The one boiled down summary word that I kept coming back to me, was the most important topic of all in this story, was family. It was the family dynamic. How did people behave in situations that they can never have foreseen, that they never deserved to have to endure? How did this family, good people, end up in this terrible, terrible place, from one thing after the other? How could that have happened to them, and does that have any sort of greater meaning to people? I know that certain people will say that it has no greater meaning. It was just a terrible family tragedy that went off the rails and that really was nobody else's business. I believe otherwise, but it's really not up to me to tell you whether I succeeded in that. In fact, I know that the law, politics, and media class in particular will have to write papers to try to react to that, and that's a great automatic. I just handed you, a paper which is, did it succeed at its own, at proving its own value as a public good in explaining what happened to this family and why that should matter to people who care about what teens go through. what the interaction between faith and sexual politics these days really plays out in a family that has already undergone a tragedy, that is trying to learn how to cope with grief, that is living in a community that is trying to help it, but in some ways is not helping it. It's a really sad story that I hope ends up serving some sort of purpose in showing people about what can happen to a family and why certain expressions of family love are more lasting, more enduring than others. My purpose in trying to walk through all these topics isn't to just sort of throw a bunch of dizzying terms at you and to say, well, this book was about 100 different things and really it's up to you to try to figure it out. But it is to try to point out that when you talk about a murder story, a crime story, and you try to figure out, well, what was it about? You can talk about the facts, but then you should also think about, well, what is the purpose of that? And did it serve any real purpose? Did it explain the world in a way that matters to other people? And does that serve the public good in helping people understand what just happened? Questions? I already have to go to you? Yes, sir.
Well, apart from the potential good of any one book, do you think that the pervasiveness of crime narratives in the press and in books have in fact had a terribly pernicious effect in creating a climate of fear when in a period when crime is actually diminishing and has diminished rapidly? People conceive themselves to be danger, and that's a huge effect on the quality of how we treat crime.
I think it's a huge role that, or mistake that writers make. We look at it way too often. The other day I was flipping around trying to find something to watch while I was exercising, and I came across Investigation Discovery Channel, which I had never bothered to watch before, and it was just one entertaining crime story after another. I was looking at TMZ the other day, and they just kept playing this video over and over of a shooting outside a club in LA, as if that matters. And it was just purely to say, hey, we have video of it, therefore it is a story. That whether it is little entertaining faux entertainment like that, or it's big stories about the big problems of crime, it doesn't serve the public because it tells people that there's a huge problem when in fact crime has been going down, and it's not what people believe. They believe that all murderers get off easily. Crime is a huge problem, and both of those things are actually quite wrong. Other questions about how the story was told, about what was... Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Yes?
When you were researching for this book, did you ever go and like sit in on the church or try to get into it or see it firsthand rather than more like hearsay and getting people's opinions on it?
I did. I attended once. There's a scene in the book where I describe the people in the church, and that came from my personal observation. I attended the church and then shortly thereafter called the minister and introduced myself and told him I was working on this story. But I did want to see it. I want to understand a little bit from seeing it, as opposed to just listening to tapes and just reading the writings and just talking to other people who had been in the church. I wanted to see it for myself. And I did, and I had a good impression of it, and I tried to communicate that. It wasn't taken that way by one of my critics, but I meant it to be a compliment of what I saw. I saw caring, impressive-looking people loving their children and seeming happy and getting a lot out of their faith experience on a Sunday morning in Fayetteville. I saw a good thing. That was the purpose of that, was to say this was, on the surface at least, looks like a healthy thing. Other questions? Yes, Keith.
I would circle back to David's question. Do you think there's a special responsibility that crime writers or journalists working in true crime genre have, as opposed to just other journalists? I mean, many of the appeal and agenda, even the topics here, could apply to lots of different stories, it seems. We just looked at the front page of the New York Times. There might be stories about abusive relationships or trauma or loyalty. So do you think a journalist trying his or her hand at true crime journalism as opposed to straight news reporting, is there anything particularly special about it, or are these the problems that beset any journalist?
Well, I think it's really the sort of underlying problem that I'm grappling with here in this discussion, which is you're dealing with people's lives, real people. This is not a work of fiction. That would be so pleasant to write about people in pain who aren't real people. These are real people, and they went through and are still going through pain. And for a writer to zero in on that and to write about that, there has to be a great justification for doing that. And I'm challenging myself by choosing this as my topic because I think it's a big question. And it's often answered the wrong way, or it's performed the wrong way by writers who are simply exploiting people's tragedy. And I tried very hard not to do that. Perceptions to the contrary notwithstanding, that isn't what I set out to do. I did set out to hit on some of these issues, to explain them, to show them, while balancing the undeniable pain that this brings to a family. I had a long meeting with the Rufo family. This is Esther Rufo's family, Tim Ginichetti's mother's family. I had a long meeting with them when I was working on this story, and it ended, literally ended, with my admission that when one of them, I don't recall who, when one of them said, well, what am I supposed to tell my children? What are my children supposed to think of you, meaning me, for doing this to our family, for writing this story about our family? It was the most painful moment in all of my reporting on this story, and maybe all of my reporting ever, because I answered honestly. I said, I wouldn't blame that child for hating me for doing that. And I meant it, and it doesn't make me feel good about that downside, that negative pull that this story, or any true crime story, has. We're looking at people's lives, their tragedies, and we're trying to get something out of it, hoping that that something is worth it. There's a good enough reason for doing it that it's worth it. I obviously think it is. I'm not going to stand here and say, well, I can't tell you whether I... Of course I think it is. I wouldn't have done it otherwise. I certainly didn't do it for the money. But I can't answer that for any reader. And any reader could look at this and say, don't believe that it succeeded. I don't believe that I got any real value out of this that teaches me something about the world that I need to know that would make up for this family's pain. And I understand that.
Could you talk a little bit about what the public reaction has been to the publication of your book, or what reaction you've seen, and in particular, has it been what you expected or not?
I don't know what I expected. There'll be a PostStandard story soon that will maybe make more people in Syracuse aware of it. There have been a lot of people have reacted to the story on Facebook or on my blog, saying that it shocked them, in particular about Tim's sexuality and how that struggle ended up for him. And I think that reaction didn't surprise me, because I think that's probably the most horrifying thing about this story, is that his true nature just couldn't be left alone, and couldn't be couldn't be something that he could embrace. He still can't. He still has a really hard time talking about that. But that reaction, I think, was I really expected that, and I also expected unhappiness from people in the church and the family, and I think I've seen that too. A book like this doesn't top the charts. It isn't a Bill O'Reilly who killed whoever. Those are really popular, and those go to millions of people. This is a very small little publishing project that I felt had to be done because the questions that I had and that a lot of people had, including people that work at this university who knew Tim and wondered what really happened there. There were a lot of people who had questions about that, and I set out to try to answer them. And I've had people tell me, thank you for telling that story because now I really understand what happened. And there are others who don't think that understanding happened because they disagree with my conclusions. Yes, ma'am.
This will be the last question.
So I guess a factual question, because I'm an outsider to communication, I was interested in your characterization, on the one hand explaining something and on the other judging it. And given that people might disagree with some of your characterization, I'm just wondering what the sort of orthodox distinction is within communication between explaining and judging. Or maybe I could reframe it by saying, are there areas in the book where you feel like your explanation could be legitimately disagreed with on a factual basis?
A lot of, if I may turn that around a little bit, a lot of people say, is this objective?
Yeah.
Did you come to this objectively? And did you tell the story objectively? And I'd like to think, and I do believe, that I came to it objectively, meaning that I didn't know what had happened, and I didn't know what any of this was about, and I didn't have particularly strong ideas about any of it. But I came to have strong ideas about it, and I expressed those. I came to conclusions, and I wasn't shy about expressing those conclusions in the book. And I think that that itself is controversial in journalism because it's either straight journalism or it's opinion journalism. But narrative storytelling almost always comes to some sort of conclusion. The writer almost always leads you to a conclusion, a point that the writer himself has reached. And I did reach that conclusion based on the facts as I found them, not based on what I wanted to be true, but what I found to be true. And so I think that's an honest form of bias or conclusion, as opposed to deciding at the outset, I'm going to show this as an example of something that I hate and that I want to hold up to ridicule. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, Mark.